Recording. Thank you, everybody, for joining us at our March CSOC working group meeting. Hello to Michael, if you're watching this. And today we are going to have Jawad talk a bit about some discussions that have been happening in the background and ask for your feedback on sort of where we think we should go next. And so with that, Jawad, I think I'm going to hand it over to you.
Thank you, Sarah. Um, I'll start sharing my screen, and I'll go over a little bit of the things. Might be a little bit overlapping with what we shared last time, maybe a little bit more refined because we've had a little bit more to think about it, time to think about it. But yeah, I'll quickly go over some of the vision of what components we're hoping to be building and incorporating into what's going to turn into the CSOC portal. What's already been worked on, where we are, some progress on it. And then also, I would like to ask all of you, Plum, and I think you were part of the other discussion as well, but just which pieces of this whole thing would make more sense to you guys from a community perspective. Um, we're also selfishly building a lot of this for ourselves, but at the same time, we want to build something that would be um, important and useful for the community as well. Um, yeah, I'm gonna talk about a few patterns on how we're thinking about the bootstrapping or the rollout of this would look like, um, and potential future improvements. So I don't remember if I shared this diagram on the last CSOC meeting, but this is sort of the overall idea of the different pieces that we're hoping to bring all in under like a single pane of glass portal thing. Um, this one being sort of the most crucial one so far, at least. Right now, the biggest barrier to entry seems to be for most people to just get up and get started with running enterprise cloud infrastructure. We do have some infrastructure code ourselves that we've built over the years, and the community, as they've started running Gen3 in different ways, have also developed a few things. And one of the items on Bob's wish list has been to being able to incorporate a lot of the work and the engineering that's been going on in these different institutions and bring that all back into this project essentially. Um, Bob is actually in Australia right now. That's why he's not here. But Australia has built out basically a whole AWS infrastructure deployment using CDK. And they presented it, I guess, like a couple of meetings ago. And um, Chromeware has previously deployed Gen3 into the Google Cloud platform. Um, and they have some Terraform for it. We do have some Terraform for Azure to at least spin up pieces of the infrastructure, although we've never really done a full deployment into Azure. But the idea is that sort of we build out a different, sort of a plugin system, which is mostly community driven, is at least the idea. So we can have all these different infrastructure as code pieces that are written and maintained by the community, but we can leverage them in here in sort of infrastructure as code plugin to basically spin up all the pieces needed to deploy Gen3. Um, it's not to exclude, like if you already know how to manage your own infrastructure, you shouldn't have to go through this piece. So we bringing your own infrastructure is also like a big piece of the puzzle here um, that we're going to have to support. And maybe that's how we run this ourselves as well, because we already have a lot of the infrastructure. Um, yeah. Other pieces is basically whenever we deploy Gen3 to use the best practices that are out there, for doing deployment managing and managing the life cycle of the applications. For our scenario, and I think that's going to be the same for a lot of the communities, we're using Argo CD to basically bootstrap and manage all of the configurations of Gen3, essentially. So whatever we're building here, we need to basically do the same thing and follow the same practices, which means that we also have to bootstrap Argo CD, which is yeah, part of this whole thing. Monitoring is another big one. So being able to provide insight into what's going on into your Gen3 deployments is high on the wish list that we've heard, at least. Yeah. And then the CSOC portal itself, we need to think about the auth and RBAC portion. So the first iteration of the CSOC portal will have some sort of authentication mechanism, but the RBAC will come later. So whoever gets authenticated to begin with will have super admin rights. And for the future, we're hoping to be able to build out some sort of integration where you can set up different roles or user personas, and then they can do different parts of the functionality instead of getting the full functionality. And I believe all of us are familiar with running things in the cloud, and they can get costly. And sometimes it's hard to get a good overview. So for us, at least, this is a key portion for us to be able to provide our project managers and stakeholders the ability to check, like, okay, how much are we actually spending on cloud cost? Which portions are costing what? And being able to provide that sort of data. I'm just going to pause here and give like the floor to you guys to see if there are any pieces here that you think are more important than others for you guys, so that will help shape the future development cycles and narrow down maybe the scope of where we focus development efforts, essentially. And if there are other features that would be really good to have, that you can think of, yeah.
This is just a simple question. We are been working a little bit in deploying Gen 3 in OpenShift, like Red Hat OpenShift. Would
Mhm.
that be considered in this design under the bring your own infrastructure?
Yes, it would
Okay.
be. So the way yeah, the way this whole portal works is that you deploy this portal itself somewhere. And then let me see if I have an architecture diagram. Yeah. So depending on where you deploy the portal itself, in this diagram, we're just deploying it into EKS, but you could deploy this into OpenShift, or somewhere else. The idea is that there is an agent running in the cluster where you want to run Gen 3. It could be the same cluster as well, or you can have multiple clusters. But that agent connects back to this main CSOC portal. And then from here, we're able to manipulate this cluster however we want to. So we can bootstrap things, and if we want to, we can have some sort of identity here to also set up other pieces of the puzzle, such as the buckets and other infrastructure, essentially. Uh, yeah.
That makes sense. Thanks.
Yep. Um, yeah, good question. But yeah, that's exactly why we need to keep this bring your own infrastructure piece. So Um, the idea is that we would have to go through all these steps. In this diagram, I've sort of thought of the flow of how we would run and bootstrap the whole thing. And I can go over like a few demos as well, on how it potentially would look like. So obviously you have to start somewhere. You're starting from scratch. You don't have any enterprise infrastructure. You can run it using, for example, Docker or just a binary. You start locally, you configure some cloud credentials, and then bootstrap the CSOC itself. And then you start accessing the bootstrapped CSOC that's running in the cloud. to essentially bootstrap the well, the other pieces of the puzzle. We can then define what should run in the management cluster. We have the CSOC itself. We have to set up some monitoring stacks and potentially other applications in the future if we agree that they make sense to have. We use a Grafana stack a lot just because it doesn't have to store any of the data locally. It stores that in a bucket, and we basically rely on the bucket scaling to be able to hold all that monitoring data. And for us, it's been very instrumental in getting off expensive enterprise tools and just relying on open source tools. Yeah. And then we can also build in certain views and dashboards on top of these applications to give sort of a view into what's going on into your Gen3 deployment. Yeah, the next part of the flow, like you would have to go and you go through the wizard of configuring your Gen3 deployment. And then once you hit deploy, we basically bootstrap with Argo CD. We set up either an existing repository or a new repository. So we need some GitHub credentials potentially. But the idea is that then once you've set it all up, Argo CD can read your manifests, and then we have the actual secrets in a secrets manager. And then Gen3 would basically be spun up in here, and we could follow the same pattern in any sort of Kubernetes cluster, essentially. Yeah.
So, Jawad, am I right in my understanding that what you just described is like the vision, right?
Correct. Yeah. That's sort of where we're working towards so that we build in best practices and have like a very opinionated way of setting up Gen3, but also have it be flexible enough so that it can run on bring your own infrastructure or whatever infrastructure is provided.
Got it. And what you're hoping to get today is feedback from our group about like which of these, because this is not what we'd be able to like launch as alpha. Is that right?
Correct. There's going to be certain features that are not going to be part of the first alpha release. So we're hoping to do a release soon where we'll have to narrow down what we basically do feature complete. I can quickly go over a few demos as well on where we are on the different features here. And that'll probably help as well. But from what I've gone over so far, would any of these features be helpful? And I can also do demo to demonstrate these different features so that it's easier to understand where they would fit into you guys' flow and potentially other people that are part of the Gen3 community.
Yeah, I mean, this is, continuously very awesome and what you guys are trying to do, especially with the amount of data comments and data matches that you guys have to manage, right? When I say you, like the Center for Translation and Data Sciences. And certainly we want to figure out where we fit into the model. I think that the, BYOI is where we fit into it, and some of the out of the box things that we have created. We have about, let's just say, 12 functions with our iOS infrastructure that can be utilized in day one. And if the CTDS's CSOC portal surpasses those functions, certainly, would be a great opportunity for us to switch. Alternatively, another option of synergy would be is that if there's functions that are existing infrastructure's code cannot support, while the CSOC portal does support, we can utilize both.
Yeah.
Because in the center of all that is Argo CD, which is the GitOps component of it.
Correct.
So, we want to find that synergy of things that we can do today based on the library of functions that we're have available to us versus the capabilities and functions that are very specific to Gen 3. They don't come boxed with any other type of IOC.
Yeah. And I think that's what was also brought up last time is when we have Gen 3 specific functionality in here. So I think someone mentioned the ability to basically monitor and get shells into the database clusters or the Elasticsearch clusters. So basically these different Gen 3 specific pieces, which other tools don't cover, um, is is helpful. At least that's what I believe that was the Chromeware people's response to this question. Um, yeah, it is
Maybe.
that right? And that's where you were heading as well, Plumman, is like having the
Yeah,
Gen.
yeah. I mean, certainly, there are going to be native things that we can do with our IOC while you guys are building this more customized way of doing Gen 3 where we can say, oh, well, we don't need to figure this out. CTS already has figured out how we
Yeah.
do your lever stack component, right?
Mhm.
And ultimately utilize both our I our IOC stack in conjunction with the CTDS IOC stack.
Got it. Cool. Okay, so I can just go over a few things where we are and what we're hoping to get done for the first release. So the first part here is that we do have a key cloak. Well, that was probably not the best way to show it, but there is a key cloak integration here. So if I can just log out, we can do the whole flow again. Yeah. So basically, there's a key cloak running, and you can authenticate against it. So you can have local users, or you can have that be configured with a remote identity provider. That's up to you. Um, but the idea is that we have some sort of key cloak integration. In the future, we would like to have some sort of RBAC functionality. I believe key cloak has something called groups, where you can set up RBAC-like functionality. Be cool to explore. I've not had the experience to play with it yet, but I believe the Australia Biocommons had some prior experience with playing with Keycloak. So that was the auth portion. We do have, I don't know if I've shown this before, but we're working on sort of a wizard to configure your values YAML file based on a set of questionnaires, essentially. So you can decide on what functionality you want. Personally, I would like to abstract this a little bit more, but I need to work with some internal teams on how we would do that. But instead of saying hatchery, we would say workspaces and um, yeah, some abstraction apart from this microservice names that would probably be more helpful for someone just getting started with Gen 3. And then just some easy screens to be able to understand how to configure authentication and authorization, although that's still controlled by the user YAML. So yeah, there in terms of yeah, I believe I've shown this before as well. There's a whole Kubernetes insight as well into different clusters. You can choose if you had multiple agents deployed, which cluster to look into. Um, yeah, we've recently started working on sort of I need to be a little careful here to use the comments that we don't have like real production data, but something like this where you can get a view into like, okay, I have a Gen3 deployed at this host name. What is going on in there? And here you can sort of see a little bit. And I tried to log in earlier, and here you can see some of my requests and which service is responding to those requests. And so this view here is sort of reliant on the Grafana stack being deployed. And right now, for me, this is just querying whatever we use internally. So we can quickly get a look. Oh, okay. Was there any errors? Oh, there was a 404 here, but that doesn't seem like a real thing. So that's, yeah, we could potentially, get a quick overview of what's going on into the different Gen3 deployments. And here you can also see like who's doing what as long as they're authenticated. This is all just extrapolated from our Nginx logs. So it's relatively simple, but potentially in the future, we could add some more parts here. Yeah, there's also a little bit of an overview of like what's going on with your EC2 instances. So you can just go in and take a look. Oh, okay, so this is what we have in our account and or multiple accounts. Right now, it only works with one account. And something similar for the buckets that we have, essentially. Yeah, this is sort of the things which we're working on. Yeah. We're hoping to release like a subset of these functionalities at least once we're finished with them as a first release. And then some way of essentially running this in a non-development scenario easily. Yeah. That's most of the things that I had to share for today, and I'm open for questions or comments or any sort of feedback that you guys might have on how, yeah, that'll basically shape the next few development cycles, essentially, the feedback that we get.
I have a question.
Mhm.
Are there, so obviously you can't launch all of the features in the alpha. And so are there any features where you're just really undecided, which ones to prioritize that you'd like to ask the group about specifically, or you just want to hear from the group whether, there's uh
I think that's a great question. So I believe this infrastructure as code portion integration, since it relies on a lot of help from the community, I don't think that can be part of the first release. I have a quick demo of that as well. So if you want to look at it, the idea is that it should not be hidden in screen, like you can get to this similar sort of view. This is just for demo purposes. But you deploy it and in the background or using a log window like this, the different templates that we want to deploy with a different sort of input gets executed. And we basically get to spin up all this. Right now, it's just bootstrapping an S3 bucket and SQSQ that Gordon shared with me. But in the future, this could be, all the networking, the databases, the NAT gateway, the Squid instances, and any other things that we need to make sure we're deploying a secure network and components into AWS. And then we could do similar things for Google Cloud once we have the Terraform for it. And we can also run our own, like the CTDS Terraform. And yeah. But the idea is that all this should happen in these screens. But I don't think that can be part of the alpha release just because it's a huge scope creep and yeah. Bring your own infrastructure is supported though. So as I mentioned, we do agent based, and I guess the UI needs a little bit more restructuring or organizing to make it a little bit more intuitive. But if you have an OpenShift cluster, you basically would say OpenShift in the U Chicago data center, or you give it some sort of name, and you get a YAML essentially that can deploy a set of certificates that you have. And then this agent would then run and connect back. And we can sort of see some of this happening when I set up the dev environment as well. So on the right-hand side, this is the agent. So if I disconnect it, we can also go back to the UI and we can see that, oh, it disconnected. And if I now run the agent again, I probably have to compile it since I haven't done that today. It's going to be a little slow, but in about like, usually once it's compiled, it's 10, less than a second or a couple of seconds. Since the agent and the API is written in Go, we basically get binaries out of them. But yeah, now this cluster is connected and we can start manipulating whatever Kubernetes config is inside this agent. The idea is that there's a service account, and this is essentially the context for this agent to be able to manipulate Kubernetes through it. Right now, it's just a cluster admin role. You could restrict it to a view or read-only role as well. I do want to touch upon one other subject where like this pattern of starting locally and bootstrapping a management cluster. Alan, I think we talked about it a little bit last meeting, the cluster API. This is sort of the same pattern that the cluster API is following as well. So you start locally, but you start by setting up a local management cluster using Minikube or something, and then you install cluster API, and from there you bootstrap a management cluster. So this pattern itself isn't unheard of. It's sort of the same problem that we're solving. It's just, I do want to try out the cluster API itself to be able to spin up clusters. And for people that are not familiar, cluster API is basically managing one or more clusters from one single Kubernetes cluster using Kubernetes CRDs. It's the 2025 way of doing all this, which is we don't have any experience with it, and be able to run this in production, we are not ready for it. But if you guys get any sort of experience with this, I would love to hear your thoughts and feedback on whether or not this is a viable option. I know this is also part of the Rancher Turtles product. So that one also builds on top of the cluster API concepts, essentially.
Tuan, I just have a quick question for you that kind of just came up to my mind. So bear with me for a second.
Sure.
So the portal you're trying to build is obviously helping you guys, the CTES team, given the fact that you guys manage so many different data comments and streamlining that process. So essentially the byproduct from it becomes is a Gen3 cloud service management portal, essentially for anybody else that would be running multiple data comments.
Yep.
And be able to do very similar things that you guys are doing through that process. And anybody that can run multiple data comments has their own way of thinking about how to do that, because they do have like in-house expertise. And if anybody manages like that client that manages multiple data comments, are not going to be relying on just the UI to be able to do things through without the advanced DevOps functions within their own, technical house, right?
Right.
How do we manage, and this is the whole point where I continue trying to figure this out, where we kind of fit into that piece a little bit of, having a different way of doing it, but somehow utilizing your guys' expertise and the services that you provide into this portal. Like, what we like, if, for example, like with an API to your guys' admin portal,
No, so the
yeah,
admin portal
place, or
itself will
where
be a
would
Helm
it be?
chart. So if you're already familiar with Helm and Kubernetes, so then you would just deploy this as another Helm chart into however you're managing everything, right? So it just becomes part of all of the other applications that are part of your stack, and you can still leverage the CSOC or admin portal, but then you just don't do any infrastructure as code. Just you have your own infrastructure, you deploy this Helm chart, and you still get this UI, and you can do, a lot of these other functionalities that are here. So you can leverage a subset of these functionalities if you want to.
So they
Um,
can live side by side, essentially.
100%, yeah. So for example, these ones are based on pure Helm. This is basically just an API around Helm. And I believe this one isn't even deployed through this portal. And I believe neither of these Gen3 deployments in my cluster are deployed there. But I could manipulate them if I wanted to. But doesn't mean that they have to be deployed through this portal, essentially. Um, yeah. So you can do parts of parts of the things
Yeah.
however you want to do it, and if you already have like sorry, I keep switching, but a Grafana stack, and if we go into like the Grafana integrations that we're sort of building in, all
Yeah.
we would really need is just somewhere where we can query it, like a Loki. We
Right.
would potentially need like some labels, but those get added by our Helm charts, essentially. So
Yeah, no, makes sense. Can I make a suggestion?
yeah,
At
for
least
sure.
from my perspective, right? Because I find very good use on this. Functionality wise, even with some of the Grafana stuff that you guys are doing here, ultimately kind of creating some very specific things related to Gen 3 versus just the general EPM services, right? Where they just tell you about, 25 404s, but does it really matter when you know how your Gen 3 operates? Those are not really a good point, and a lot of noise. So this is great, but initially, as you have, the login services, perhaps where coexistence will be helpful initially would be is that a IT support shop of multiple data commons can select, choose, and pick the services that are enabled as part of the U Chicago CTDF admin portal. So they can kind of go through that initial pre-existing requirement concept. So not everything is, enabled in there. And they can select, I want this, I want this, I want this in the coexisting model because I'm going to do Y and Z and so on through the other way I'm doing that. But if a new feature is enabled in the CCDS admin portal, then that feature could be enabled, but it's not all enabled by default.
Right. Yeah. Is that similar to like this wizard, but just like post deployment, so you can choose and like turn off services or features?
Yeah, even before this, right? The first part of is which of your right clusters, right, do you want to manage?
Right.
And then which features in those clusters do you want to manage?
Mm-hmm.
Options, whatever you want to call. I don't know if you have a short name for the CTDS admin portal features you want to enable for these management components. So like that would help decide which was used where, right? Obviously, with a goal eventually for the admin portal to take care of every other pieces that are being done and everybody contributing to it. But initially, knowing they're like, I have these 7 things I'm doing separately, and the admin portal gives me these 5 things, I'm going to select those 5 things. Now I have actually more capabilities than I ever had before.
Yeah. Uh, Potentially, we would have to just map out like what those things are and how we would basically do them. Um,
For example, like do it some type of this, like normally what you do, and this is purely from a security perspective,
yeah.
right? So I'm just applying that principle. You do a discovery.
Mhm.
What access does the admin portal, for example, have, and what uh, clusters or accounts that separately are running Gen3 are available? Two is if those accounts are available, right? It could be a cluster within multiple clusters within the same AWS account or any account, Azure or whatnot. The second thing is, right, what microservices are those Gen3 clusters running, right?
Mhm.
And then based on that discovery and knowing what they're running, then select what you want to manage to do the admin portal and what features you want the admin portal to allow based on what its capabilities are.
Right. And then that is for an already running Gen3, essentially. Like if you were going to import that into being managed by the admin portal, is that what you're saying?
Yeah, exactly. Because,
Yeah.
it's going to be very unlikely, at least in my point of view, to find somebody that, doesn't already manage multiple
Right.
comments. And even if somebody is managing multiple data commons eventually and they want to use the service, they just run through the discovery service first,
Mhm.
then making those selections, and then obviously always going to be able to go and make those changes. But that's the piece that I feel like could help, work together with everything else that they're doing. So they're not always competing against like, well, I'm doing this way.
That makes total sense. And I think the gluing piece is just going to be that the configuration will always just live in GitHub. So whether it's the CSOC manipulating it or you're already deploying Gen3 through it, the configuration should always be in Git. That's the principle of GitOps, essentially. So when we're incorporating existing deployments, we would basically be doing the exact same things. Like we would from here make changes in Git and rely on Argo um, to be able to deploy those changes for us. So whether we're starting a new deployment or there's an existing Gen3 deployment, um, this is that portion. But I think that's a really good point that we're eventually going to start feeling soon when we're doing the migration from a cloud automation deployment into Argo CD managed deployment.
Right, exactly. And you're not going to know all these components. So the discovery component to this, the initial component of it, this is a fundamental everything, right? How many
Mhm.
computers do I manage, right? How many
Right.
3 things do I manage? What do I have access to, right?
Mhm.
And it tells you I don't have access to this. So, like how do you like the enrollment process into it? Uh,
Yeah.
I think would be very helpful and relevant of what IOC components they have, but I find that the discovery component a fundamental piece that would be very helpful.
Yeah. Discovery of like what services are running in that commons, and if we're starting to manage it through CSOC, like what do we need to enable?
Yeah,
Or
so it's the first piece. The second piece is that, but the piece is, hey, I am Portal UI AI.
yeah,
I know that you told me that I have access to X, Y, and Z data comment, but I only have access to X and Z. And also, I don't have access to Y. But for X and Z, they're running these services. Are these the services you want me to help you manage?
yeah. I potentially, I think we could do something like that where we have some sort of intake form or something, I guess, where yeah, the user or the operator gets some sort of input opportunity to say like, yeah.
So like, for example, we have, and we're a multi-data comments service provider, and some of our services provided by you guys, I think, rightfully and amazing. Some are provided by us. So we have multiple AWS organizations and multiple GCP, accounts. So we're everywhere, right? And if we deploy this portal as a service provider on multiple Gen3 data comments, we want to be selective of which ones they're managed and which ones are serviced by other Gen3 providers,
Right.
essentially.
I don't know if you see that Alan has his hand up as well.
Okay.
Oh,
Yeah, I just watching the time here. I see we only have a few minutes left. I just wanted to chime in and say I'm probably coming at this from the exact opposite end of Plowman. Plowman, very experienced, runs a lot of commons. But from the perspective of somebody who doesn't have a lot, who's managing a small number, I would say the infrastructure piece would have been, or well, is, and would be my number one priority. I know you said it's too complicated to include in an alpha, but please, keep that as much as you can close to the forefront as you're thinking about this, building this out. Having, the way you described it, having that very opinionated way of doing a deployment would be great. I would love to have that in this kind of, of an interface, to be able to, pick, let's just say AWS. That's all we're really worrying about at this point.
Yeah.
To be able to pick that and say, yep, let's do one of those. And, let's do it in the way that the community says this is how you should do it. That would be great. The other thing, it's more of a question building on this conversation we're just having from an operational standpoint. Can you talk about how you would see just very simple operational tasks? For example, how do you do it today and how would you do it in this model? Does it change at all? Something as, I'll say, as straightforward, and it's not really that straightforward, but just like an EKS version upgrade.
Mm-hmm.
How do you do that today? And how, I think I know, but just to clarify how you're doing it today, but then how you would see that changing in this kind of a deployment.
Yep. There isn't a view for it here, but the way we do it today is we basically rerun the same Terraform against that, but just with the version changed. So whatever, and we actually use a GitOps approach for our Terraform as well. But
the TerraGrunt and Atlantis.
TerraGrunt portion,
yeah, right,
yeah.
Right.
This is just for us to conveniently being able to manage all of our accounts, basically. But when we're doing the upgrades, we would just go in and change like one variable from EKS. Oh, I can't change this, but yeah. But yeah, we would basically toggle one version and then rerun this Terraform. So the way I am envisioning it would happen, like day two operations is basically that part. How do you do maintenance and how do you do upgrades on certain portions of the infrastructure? And in this scenario, you would basically just rerun the same templates, just with different variables to be able to do those upgrades. And that's also the most complex portion of things as well. Because Terraform itself stores its state in an S3 bucket, and that doesn't always, like if someone's manually gone in and upgraded this cluster, then there's a drift between the state and what's like in the real world. So those are sort of the complexities that we would have to build in some sort of functionality for, but I'm envisioning that we can sort of have a list of all of your different clusters and you can see the versions. And the idea is that these different plugins, as we're calling them, these are basically just Docker containers around the infrastructure as code here. That we would have to define some sort of way of providing input and dealing with the output of these plugins, essentially, that we then can plot into AUI or give users the ability to override while they're trying to deploy them. But the idea when, for example, it's as simple or complicated as doing Kubernetes upgrades for these providers, at least, it's just as easy as toggling the version number and doing the upgrades. But there's also complexities such as that you can only do one version bump at a time. So if you're going from, for example, say like 128 to 131, you have to go through like 129, 130, and then 131. So those sort of limitations are what we would have to build around in this opinionated way of doing deployments. And the other benefit of running these just as containers of already open source code is that we can always just link back to these so that power users such as Plummet or Chromeware or others that know how like Terraform works and they just want to deploy it into their own way, they can also do that. Or if there's some CDK experts there that wants to leverage CDK, we can just link them back to the original code base and they can just take it and run it their own way and basically become part of this, then bring your own infrastructure. Hopefully that answered your question.
It did. That's helpful. Thank you.
All right. Well, we have 3 more minutes. I don't know if there's any other questions or if, Jawad, there was anything else you wanted to cover before the end of our meeting.
I just have a quick, sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead, please.
I just had a quick comment before when you were showing the Wizard UI to create the Elm version of Gen3. You mentioned like you would like to abstract one more layer and instead of having the service name, having a description of like what is going on. I think, at least it's just my point of view, but I don't think you should spend too much time on these because I think the main lack here is that there's always been a lack of documentation overall for like the Gen3 infrastructure of like a list of all the services and what any one of those were doing, which I learned over time. But for a starter, it's hard to understand. So I think this could just be solved with a documentation page with a list of services and a description on what they do. You can just link it out here. I don't think you need to add extra complexity here. One thing that, of course, is not important for us, but would be nice for later version, would be the ability to add your own service in here.
Oh, that's actually a great call out. Yeah. So you have your own Docker images of services. You can provide some paths maybe so that it gets added to Rev Proxy somehow, and then you can add your own. That's actually a really good idea. Yeah. I'll see what I can do with that. So yeah.
Again, this is not important for Alpha, but just like something to think about for down the line.
For sure. No, I think that was a great call out. Yeah.
But this work is incredible. Thank you very much for putting it together.
For sure. Regarding the services, I believe at some point we did have like an overview of like what the services are doing and
Yeah, it should be in the development now. So if you look in the developer docs,
That is probably my bad. I haven't reviewed the updated documentation page.
yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh yeah, that's so if it there we go. Or maybe under key repositories too, actually, that like goes through and describes what each of the services does.
And I think we can leverage this as an opportunity to build in these docs, as Lucas said, in here and say like, hey, do I want index D? What is index D? So if I like maybe get a link clicking this question icon or something that goes in and shows you the different index D specific portions. Yeah, I guess the
Juwan, is there and I know we're running out of time, but in regards to services, like there's got to be a point of concept of, whoever is going to be building this, that they have some information about it. And you can, like, for example, you can't just have an index D service running to run data comments. So it's like a package of things that you have to have, right? Like,
yeah
so, perhaps that could be ultimately of, the two concepts, data comments where it runs all, most by default, or data mesh,
right
which is
different
pretty
bundles
selective
of
for you.
services.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that makes sense as well. Like,
Or a
so
mini data comments that selects them. But other than that, right? Like then you go down to the path of DCFS, right? Like the common services component, which is the bare minimum, right? Which is the authentication wall.
yeah, yeah, I think maybe adding some tags like this
Yeah.
is useful for a mesh. Like this is a mesh service, especially for like token service that we have. Could be helpful as well in this
I would
view.
like create 3 radio buttons on top. Like that's just my thought. Like just right off the bat. Am I running a data mesh? Am I running the data comments? Or am I running the data comments framework
Yeah,
services? And then it pre-selects them for you. Then you can add additional things after that. But like that's the top categories of how those services intertwine between the three different buckets of Gen3.
yep. That makes sense, I think. To clarify, like, yeah, yeah, between a mesh and just the regular data commons.
Right.
Yeah. And I think like something else to build on top of Luca's point of deploying your own APIs or services in here, maybe add like a step of like, hey, these are the scheduled jobs that I want to run as well. So we can have like maybe ETL or other jobs run on schedule, but then also your own Docker images if you have anything that is very specific to your Gen3 deployment that you know you're going to run on a schedule that you're able to set up these jobs. At some point, I did set up like a UI here that can, trigger jobs and look at previous executions of jobs. But maybe here we could have like custom jobs as well.
No,
Anyway,
I think that the customization does make sense.
it does.
Yeah, that's really good.
Yeah. We're 3 minutes over time. My apologies. But I think this was very good. Very, very glad to hear how this can be helpful for you guys.
Any last minute comments for me to add to our notes? Also, Jawad, you weren't over. Technically, I'm the one who started us late.
True.
All right. Well, thank you everybody for following the breadcrumbs of Zoom links and finding us. And we'll see you in a month. I can't remember exactly when our next meeting is, but it should be the last Wednesday in April.
That's good. Thank you. Have a good one.
Oh.
You, bye guys.
Bye.